It started as a comfort, a sweet reminder that love lingers, even in loss. But then, they kept coming. I thought it was just grief playing tricks on me, but these letters, they're different. The words are so personal, so vivid, and somehow, they know things no one else could. And now, they're not just breaking my heart, they're making me physically sick. Join me as I uncover the truth behind these messages, before it's too late. Subscribe now to follow the journey. It was never going to be him. I was with him as he sat in a hospital bed. I was with him as he was lowered into the ground, and I was with him as I gave him flowers every week. So, I knew it was never going to be him. But love makes us do illogical things. Grief of love especially so. We fell in love with each other fast. It was in the second year of college. Dylan was the charming bartender who could get any number, and I was the waitress who flirted with anyone to get large tips. Yet despite that, we fell for each other, and we fell hard. We couldn't spend a moment away from each other, with every night being a date, and every weekend being a small road trip to neighboring cities. Everything we did was together, and everything we were was each other. After college, we obviously moved in together, and it wasn't a month later that Dylan got down on one knee, and I said yes. The wedding was nothing extravagant, just our close family and friends in an old chapel outside the city. The peeling white paint and earwig-infested wood was all a part of the charm for us. We didn't need a spectacular venue. We just needed each other. Because we loved each other. Even after the wedding, our honeymoon phase never ended. We still loved each other just as much as the day we met, even until the end. The letters started about 6 months after we had gotten back from our honeymoon trip. Dylan had just gotten transferred into a new position at the software company he worked at in the neighboring city. Too far to commute, and too close for us to unearth our life. I had just gotten a promotion at the hospital where I was working and didn't want to move. And Dylan, being the amazing husband he was, assured me that everything was going to be fine. The position was hybrid, only requiring him to be away a week of every month, and with his new salary, he could easily rent out a small apartment to use during that time. Still, I worried, to have such periods apart from each other so soon after our wedding. Perhaps we were a little codependent, but it was no problem. So that's how the letters started. The letters from my Dylan. During the last week of every month, Dylan would send me a letter updating me on what he was up to during the week he was away, with every note also professing his unending love and how much he missed me. We still did phone calls, of course, and more often than not, he would arrive back home before the letter did. We'd then read them together in bed, with me wrapped in his arms. It was so nice. Dylan had a fascination with the antique romance of posting a letter to me. He even thrifted an old typewriter that he kept in his apartment away from home that was solely dedicated to sending our love letters. Its brass keys corroded with age, containing small misalignments like the E key being slightly raised when compared to every other character in the sentence. Dylan even aged all the paper and envelopes to give it a more authentic feel, adding a cherry red seal on top of every letter, stamped with our initials in a heart. It was cute, and it felt like I was the Juliet to his Romeo. Of course, that story also ends with a tragedy. It was the weekend before Christmas, when he was driving back from his last week away. The route he took home used back streets through farmlands and forests, with only the faintest signs of civilization being seen. The rotten wooden fences lining each side of the road encased rarely seen cows. There were no streetlights and very few stop signs, which allowed Dylan to quickly get home. But most importantly, he passed by the old chapel that we got married in. It had been several years since then, with the chapel falling into disarray and abandonment. The antique and vintage feel that Dylan so loved now falling into rot and decay. Still, he loved to drive by it. I won't go into detail about the accident, just that it was dark, and the squall of snow that night only allowed for a few feet of vision. When the hospital I worked at called me and told me to come, I did without a second thought. I knew he wasn't going to make it, but we still spent all of our moments together just as we always had. Dylan even left me one last letter to be read the week after he was gone. A final profession of his love and a goodbye, stamped with the same cherry red seal that contained our initials in a heart. The grief hit me hard. It still hits me even now, especially with everything that has happened. Packing up the apartment he had was the worst part. The place was barren with only the basic necessities with the exception of the writing desk. It was a testament to us. Framed photographs of our wedding day littered the large mahogany. Dozens of stacks of yellowed paper and jars of red wax reminded me of his scent. Then there was the typewriter. Its dark body and brass keys well oiled and cleaned of any dust. I am not ashamed in the least to admit that I cried the entire night as I packed it all into boxes. It was a month after Dylan had passed when I found the next letter on the welcome mat of our front door. It was gently placed right in the center, facing the door with its red seal. Originally, I didn't think anything was amiss. I even smiled as I picked it up and brought it inside to be read. I thought it was simply one of his letters that had been delayed in arriving. Even reading the letter, nothing was strange at first. It wished me a Merry Christmas and expressed that it was excited to see me soon. It distinctly ended with, "Until death do us part, Dylan." I thought it was a kind of check-in with me to make sure I was doing well as he was away. I was wrong. Then the next letter arrived, same time as the others, at the start of every month. No matter how struck with grief I was, I could think logically, and I knew something was wrong. However, there seemed to be nothing strange with the letter. It detailed what it had been doing in the last week, telling me that it was working hard for me, and that it was excited to see me soon. It professed its love and signed using Dylan's name. "Until death do us part." I wanted to throw the letter in the garbage. I knew there was nothing connecting this letter to Dylan. Even so, it was so nice to hear its words telling me how loved I was, so I couldn't throw it away. Still, I questioned how it could be happening. It was written on the same aged paper that Dylan exclusively used, and the small details in the keys of his typewriter were still present. I even suspected that Dylan's materials had been stolen, but when I frantically checked the boxes in the basement, everything was as it was supposed to be. The next month, the letter arrived again, gently placed at the front door. This time, things were seemingly a little more honest. It actually assured me slightly. It addressed my worries, that I was probably confused, that it still loved me and was doing everything it could to be with me, and it told me things that only Dylan would know. Little details about our wedding, whispers only we shared in phone calls as he drove home from work. It was stupid, but it actually made me a little convinced that he was sending me these letters. Like I said, love makes us do stupid things. So, I kept the connection going. At the start of every month, I would read a letter from my dead husband. It wasn't good for my grief. It delayed the process. I knew it was unhealthy, but I couldn't let go. I kept reading the letters, happy that my husband had somehow come back in some form. However, small things began to spoil that happiness. It always starts with the small things. At first, it was the constant insistence that it was excited to see me again soon. In every letter, it would insist that we would meet face to face soon. It unnerved me, but thought ultimately that it was similar to how people reassure those in grief that they eventually be with their loved ones again. Still, the Dylan in the letters repeatedly told me that we would be with each other again. It told me that it loved me and would not stop until we could be together. They also rarely spoke of our time together, or how we had met. When they did, only alluding to vague details and the day of our wedding. Details that repeated themselves in different ways, but were still limited to a small few. At some point, I also noticed that none of the letters contained any form of postage. No address to return to the sender, and no address to which to be sent. This prevented me from ever being able to send my own letter to him. It was as if the letters were being hand-delivered to my door, but I was never able to capture the exact moment they arrived or how they did so. Then there were the letters themselves, wherein before they would be tastefully aged using some of my and Dylan's favorite teas to ensure the smell persisted on the page. The letters were slowly arriving yellowed and stained. They smelled sickly sweet and had an oily grime that stuck to my fingers and stained them a cigarette yellow. I could even see what seemed to be fingerprints imprinted on the stains and oil that were present before I held the letter myself. The red seal on the front had browned to resemble a dirty sanguine color with the initials hardly visible. And most importantly, the ink that the letter was written in was a brownish smearing substance that smudged at little contact. The clean writing that professed its love for me was rotten. I went down to the basement once, where Dylan's writing supplies were being kept, just to see, and couldn't bear to look inside the mildew and leaking boxes. That's also when the sickness started. I didn't connect it to the letters. I couldn't, but I began to slowly deteriorate in health. At first, it was a cough. Phlegm and mucus filled my lungs and throat, clinging to my insides and cloying at every breath. Then my body started to be feverish. My skin leaked sweat at all hours regardless of temperature, taking on a feverish, jaundice yellow color which was accompanied by a musty scent that mixed horribly with my constant attempts at treatment with deodorant and soap. With every new letter, it felt like my condition only worsened, as if they were poisoning me, but I couldn't go without them. Even as my fingers and toes started to blacken and leak from gangrene, I couldn't possibly connect it to the letters. I didn't think Dylan would hurt me and thought the same of the letters. I was so weak I had to quit work, but at least I had my letters and their love for me. It was a little over a year after they began that the letters asked me to meet them, face to face. At first, I believed they meant the graveyard where Dylan was buried, which I visited on multiple occasions, but that wasn't it. The letters told me that it was possible for us to see each other again in the flesh. It stressed that very explicitly, that we could see each other in the flesh. So I drove out to the old chapel where we got married. It was dark on the road, and the frozen rain that pelted the ground filled potholes with ice and slush. The spring melt had just begun, leaving behind the pristine white landscape and replacing it with a dirty brown slurry of slush that brought with it the smell of all the decaying nature that was buried beneath the ground for an entire season. When I finally arrived at the chapel, it was no different. The building was a far sight from when we had gotten married. The wood was rotting through, and there was no cross. The front door was open, though, inviting me in. And so, I went. It's a small building, only a single room filled with pews and an altar at the front. So, there was nothing blocking me from seeing the yellowed papers covering every wall and the man standing at the back of the church, barely visible in the darkness. It was Dylan. It looked like Dylan. It looked exactly like Dylan, as I had seen him last. It waved me over with Dylan's broken arm and smiled at me with his mouth full of missing teeth. It wore the suit he was wearing the day I had married him and buried him. It wore the face I loved and looked at me with eyes that were not the color of my husband's. I wanted to leave right then, but the idea of turning my back away from Dylan terrified me. I don't know if it was the fear of never seeing Dylan again, or the fear of what the thing wearing Dylan would do to me that terrified me. Then it coughed out in a voice that didn't resemble my husband, in sickness and in health, and I ran as fast as I could until I couldn't hear it laughing behind me from the old chapel. I eventually limped to a farmer's house in the dead of night, where they called me an ambulance. I was admitted to a hospital, where my colleagues looked at me with such concern and pity. I was so sick, so many different viruses and toxins in my system. I don't even know how I'm alive. I left my car at the chapel, but I'm too terrified to go back for it, to confirm what I saw, to see Dylan again. I've been released from the hospital, but the letters won't stop coming. It's every day now. I haven't opened them, but I don't know how to stop them. I've tried the postal service, but they aren't delivering them. Does anyone know what I can do? Does anyone know what's happening? Please, I don't know where else to ask. The letters said, "Until death do us part," and I'm scared it might be for both sides. This is far from over. Each letter brings me closer to the truth and deeper into the mystery. So what do you think? A sign from beyond, or something much darker? Let me know in the comments. Don't miss what's coming next. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications because you won't want to be the last to know.